The morning they came for her farm, the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Sarah Vale stood on her porch, a widow at 30, watching the banker's black buggy carve tracks through the frost. He held the final notice, a piece of paper that meant 200 acres of her family's history could be erased with the scratch of a pen, and he had brought the sheriff to make sure it stuck. Her husband's heart gave out during the harvest, leaving her with the land, a mountain of debt, and a bank that showed no mercy. For months, the letters came, then the threats, and now the man on her porch, Elias Thorne, who held the mortgage. He wasn't just a banker, he was a man who believed land belonged to those strong enough to take it. And he was about to discover that Sarah Vale was not alone. 3 nights earlier, she had found a stranger bleeding in her barn. The stranger was slumped against a stack of hay, one hand pressed to a dark stain on his side, his breathing shallow and ragged. He wore the remnants of a cavalry blue shirt, torn and dusty, and his face was shadowed by a week's growth of beard and grime. Sarah didn't scream. In a territory where men often carried their troubles with them, a wounded one was less a threat than a responsibility. She fetched water and rags, her own hands trembling not from fear, but from the exhaustion of running a farm alone. His name was John, he muttered, before passing out again. For 3 days, she tended to him in the small room above the barn, changing bandages, spooning broth between his lips. He woke in fits, his eyes darting to the corners of the room as if expecting an ambush. He said little, but his hands told a story. They were the hands of a man who had held reins and a rifle, calloused and capable, now lying still and vulnerable. Down in the main house, the real storm was gathering. The Vale farm was 200 acres of good bottomland, left to Sarah by her grandfather. Her husband Thomas had borrowed heavily from the Ash Ridge Mercantile and Trust to buy new equipment, betting on a bumper crop that never came. When he died, the debt didn't. The bank's owner, Elias Thorne, had inherited the ledger and a singular philosophy. Land was the only true currency, and sentiment was a weakness to be exploited. He had already foreclosed on 3 smaller homesteads that season, consolidating them into a ranch he meant to sell to a cattle syndicate back east. Sarah's farm was the final, perfect piece. John sat at her kitchen table on the 4th day, sipping coffee, his color returning. He watched her move between the stove and the ledger book, her brow furrowed. "You're in trouble," he stated, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. Sarah didn't look up. "The payment is due tomorrow, I don't have it." He was quiet for a long moment. "And the banker, he doesn't accept excuses," she said, finally meeting his gaze. "He accepts land." The next morning, Sarah rode into Ash Ridge alone. The town was a cluster of false fronts and uneasy silence. She passed the empty Miller place, its windows boarded up. She saw old man Gable loading a wagon with the last of his belongings, his head bowed. The fear was a tangible thing, a current running beneath the dust. Inside the bank, the air was stale and quiet. Elias Thorne did not sit behind his desk. He stood at the window, looking out over what he considered his future domain. He was a man of 55, his gray hair slicked back, his suit immaculate. He turned, a thin smile on his face. "Mrs. Vale, I trust you've come to settle your account." His voice was polite, devoid of warmth. Sarah placed a small pouch of coins on the desk. "It's all I have. It's from the egg money. It's not enough." Thorne didn't even count it. He pushed the pouch back toward her. The terms were clear. The full amount or title to the land transfers to the bank. "My hands are tied." "But you changed the terms," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After Thomas died, you added a new service fee, a death fee." Thorne's smile didn't waver. "Administrative costs, my dear. The law is quite clear on the transfer of debt to a surviving spouse. The law," she countered, "also says I have a right of redemption. For 6 months. You're trying to sell it in 3. Thorne's eyes hardened. "The law also says that if I deem the asset at risk, I can act to protect my investment. And a woman alone, on a failing farm, I'd say that's a considerable risk." He leaned forward. "Be reasonable, Sarah. Take the money I'm offering for your so-called equity. It's more than you'll get at auction." She left the bank with the cold certainty that Thorne had never intended to collect the debt. He intended to collect the land. He had loaned Thomas the money knowing the crop was a gamble, waiting for the house to fall. On the ride home, the dread solidified into a hard, cold knot in her stomach. John was waiting on the porch, whittling a piece of wood into an unrecognizable shape. He read her face in an instant. He said no. She nodded, dismounting. "He's coming tomorrow, with the sheriff." That night over spare supper, John spoke more than he had in all the previous days combined. He told her he was mustered out of the 10th Cavalry 2 years prior, after a skirmish left him questioning the orders he was given. He'd been drifting since, taking work where he could find it, until a disagreement with some unsavory types over poker debt left him with a knife in his side and a long walk to the nearest light. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Because," he said, setting his fork down carefully, "you need to know that the man who owes you his life has some fight left in him. And because I've seen men like Thorne before, they only understand one language." The following dawn was the cold one from the hook, the air sharp enough to cut. Sarah stood on the porch as the black buggy emerged from the morning mist. Elias Thorne stepped out, crisp and clean, followed by Sheriff Cobb, a weary-looking man who tugged at his collar as if it were too tight. Thorne held up the foreclosure papers. "It's time, Sarah. The sheriff here is to ensure a peaceful transition." Behind her, the farmhouse door creaked open. John stepped out onto the porch, moving with a deliberate, steady pace that belied his recent injury. He didn't stand in front of Sarah, but beside her, a solid, silent presence. Thorne's eyes flicked to him, a flicker of annoyance. "This is a private matter, sir. You do well to move along." John's voice was calm, flat. "The lady isn't leaving." Thorne smirked. "The law says otherwise. And who are you to dispute it?" John met his gaze. "Someone who knows the law can be wrong. Someone who knows you padded that loan with fees that would make a loan shark blush. And someone," Thorne said, his voice dropping, "who is trespassing on bank property." "Sheriff." Sheriff Cobb took a hesitant step forward. "Now, son, don't make this difficult." John didn't move. "What's your stake in this, Sheriff?" "Cobb's farm on the North Ridge, the one with the dry well. Did Thorne promise you water rights if you smoothed this over?" The sheriff stopped, his face flushing. Thorne's smug expression faltered for just a second. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anyone to know. "Get off this land," Thorne snapped, his politeness gone. "By sundown, or you'll both be in jail for obstruction." John took one step forward, down onto the hard dirt of the yard. He looked past Thorne, past the sheriff, to the distant road. Then he said the words that would change everything, not to Thorne, but to Sarah, loud enough for all to hear. "You're not just fighting a banker. You're fighting a system he built to fail you. But he built it in a town. And a town," he said, finally turning his steel gaze back to Elias Thorne, "can tear it down." The buggy left, but the threat didn't. It hung in the cold air between them, a deadline ticking down to sundown. John watched the dust settle, then turned to Sarah. "We need to talk to your neighbors, all of them." Sarah shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her. "You heard him. The sheriff is in his pocket. They're scared. They won't risk what little they have left." John picked up the piece of wood he'd been whittling. It was taking the shape of a horse now. "Fear makes people do one of two things," he said. "They hide or they get angry. We need to show them what they should be angry about." Their first stop was the Gable farm. Old man Gable was loading the last of his furniture onto a wagon, his movements slow with defeat. He'd lost his place to Thorne just a month prior, sold for back taxes he swore he'd paid. John didn't offer sympathy, he asked a question. "Mr. Gable, when Thorne took your land, did he let you buy it back at the auction?" Gable spat in the dirt. "There weren't no auction, not a real one. His cousin from 2 counties over showed up, bid $1 an acre. Nobody else dared." John nodded, as if confirming a suspicion. "That's fraud, a sham sale. The law has a word for that." At the Miller place, now sitting empty, they found Mary Miller in a rented room above the saloon, taking in laundry. Her husband had shot himself after the foreclosure. She wouldn't speak to them at first, her eyes hollow. But John didn't ask about her pain. He asked about the paperwork. "Did your husband sign anything new just before the end? A refinancing agreement, maybe?" Mary's hands stilled in the wash basin. He said it was to lower the payments. Just a formality. Thorne came to the house. He was so kind. He brought a bottle of whiskey. They talked for an hour. My Tom signed it. He couldn't read much. 3 weeks later, they said we owed double. Piece by piece, the pattern emerged. Thorne wasn't just a ruthless banker. He was a predator who used the law as a trap. He targeted the vulnerable, the grieving, the illiterate, the isolated. He offered temporary relief with hidden clauses, called in debts early, and manipulated auctions to ensure the land came back to him or a silent partner at a fraction of its value. He wasn't just stealing farms. He was assembling an empire, parcel by stolen parcel. By late afternoon, they had visited 4 families. 4 stories of ruin, all leading back to Elias Thorne's polished desk. But stories weren't enough. They needed proof, and they needed a lawyer. The only one in Ash Ridge was a tired, whiskey-soaked man named Horace Pettigrew, who did most of his work drawing up deeds for Thorne himself. Sarah despaired, but John had a different idea. We don't need a lawyer to argue the law, he said. We need a judge to see it broken. And for that, we need a body, a town. That evening, John stood on an empty crate in front of the boarded-up general store. Only a handful of curious onlookers had gathered, their breath fogging in the lamplight. Sarah's heart sank. This was a failure before it began. John didn't shout. He spoke calmly, plainly, as if statting the weather. My name is John Holt. I served 10 years in the 10th Cavalry, enforcing the laws of this territory. I am telling you now, the law is not being enforced in Ash Ridge. It is being weaponized. Elias Thorne is foreclosing on your neighbors not because they can't pay, but because he has rigged the game so they never could. A man in the crowd, a blacksmith named Anders, snorted, That's just talk. Thorne's got the papers. He's got the sheriff. What are you gonna do, soldier? Charge the bank? John looked directly at him. No, Mr. Anders, but I am going to stand on Sarah Vale's porch at sunrise tomorrow, and I am going to refuse to let Elias Thorne set foot on her property without a lawful order from a judge, not just a bought sheriff. And when he tries, it will be assault. And every one of you who watches and does nothing will be complicit in the theft of your own neighbor's home. Is that the community you want? One where a man can be bled dry in the light of day, and we all just look at our shoes. The crowd stirred, uncomfortable. There were mutters, but no rallying cry. They dispersed into the darkness, leaving John and Sarah alone in the cold square. It didn't work, Sarah whispered, the hope draining from her. It did, John said, watching them go. Now they know what they're going to choose, and so do we. Back at the farm, a different kind of visitor arrived. Not a neighbor, but a boy of about 14, shivering on a sway-backed mare. He had a message for the ex-cavalryman, he said, from his pa was Sheriff Cobb. John took the folded note, his face unreadable. He read it by lamplight, then handed it to Sarah. The sheriff's handwriting was hurried, anxious. Thorne isn't acting alone. There's a man from the railroad staying at the hotel. They've been meeting late. Thorne not just selling land to a syndicate. He's clearing a right-of-way. The foreclosure tomorrow isn't just about your farm. It's the keystone. If he gets it, the others will fall like dominoes. He has papers, signed by a territorial judge in Santa Fe. I can't stop it. I'm sorry. The room seemed to grow colder. This wasn't just greed. It was a coordinated land grab. A judge was involved. The scale of it was terrifying. Sarah felt the walls closing in. A banker was one thing. A banker with a railroad contract and a judge in his pocket was an unstoppable force. John folded the note and tucked it into his vest. This changes nothing, he said. It changes everything, Sarah protested. How can we fight a judge? We don't fight the judge, John said, his eyes glinting in the lamplight. We prove the papers he signed are based on fraud. We make the crime so public, so undeniable, that the judge has to distance himself or be pulled down with Thorne. We force the law to work against itself. He spent the next hour by the fire writing. He wasn't drafting a legal brief. He was writing a statement, a deposition of sorts, collecting every detail from Gable, from Mary Miller, from the others. He listed dates, amounts, the names of Thorne's phantom bidders. He wrote with the precise, disciplined hand of a man who had filed military reports. This, he told Sarah, is our ammunition. Tomorrow we don't just say no, we present the evidence. We turn his foreclosure into a public trial. Sarah barely slept. She listened to the wind moan through the eaves, a sound she'd always found lonely. Tonight it sounded like a warning. Just before dawn she heard a noise outside, not the wind, the soft crunch of footsteps on frost, many footsteps. Her heart leaped into her throat. Thorne had come early. She shook John awake, her finger to her lips. He was instantly alert, moving to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. He was silent for a long moment. Then a slow, grim smile touched his lips. It's not Thorne, he whispered. She looked. In the pre-dawn gray, figures were gathering at the edge of her property where the main road met her fence line. She saw Anders the blacksmith, his massive arms crossed. She saw Mary Miller, wrapped in a shawl, standing stiffly beside him. She saw Old Man Gable, not in his wagon but leaning on a fence post, watching her house. There were others, maybe a dozen in total. They weren't carrying torches or pitchforks. They were just standing there, a silent, solid line in the half-light. They came, Sarah breathed, disbelief washing over her. Not to fight, John said, pulling on his boots. To witness. That's the first step. That's the body. As the first sliver of sun cut across the frozen fields, the black buggy appeared again, followed by a second wagon carrying two burly men Thorne employed as asset adjusters. Elias Thorne stepped out, expecting a quiet surrender. He stopped cold when he saw the line of people. His eyes swept over them, his contempt barely masked. "This is a legal matter," he announced, his voice carrying across the stillness. "You people have no business here. Go home." No one moved. No one spoke. Thorne's jaw tightened. He nodded to Sheriff Cobb, who looked more miserable than ever. "Sheriff, clear these trespassers." Cobb shifted his weight, his hand resting on his belt, but not near his gun. He looked at the faces of the people he'd known for years. He looked at John, now standing on the porch steps. He looked at Thorne. I can't arrest folks for standing on a public road, Elias." It was a tiny rebellion, but it was a crack. Thorne's face flushed with anger. "Fine." He brandished his papers. "Then by the power vested in me by these documents of foreclosure, I order you, Sarah Vale, to vacate the premises immediately." John stepped forward, blocking the path to the porch. "Before you take another step, Mr. Thorne, I have a right to examine the legitimacy of your claim." He held up the sheaf of papers he'd written. "We have documented evidence of fraudulent lending practices, of sham auctions, and of collusion to illegally seize multiple properties, including this one, for the benefit of the Red Rock Railroad line. We allege this foreclosure is not lawful, but criminal." Thorne laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Allegations from a drifter and a desperate woman. Present them to a judge. These papers are signed by Judge Worthington in Santa Fe. They are the law." Then John said, his voice dropping into a deadly calm, "You won't mind if we ensure the judge was presented with the full facts before he signed. Because if he wasn't, that's judicial fraud. And I reckon the territorial governor would be very interested in that." He took a step closer. "Or we can settle this here. You produce the original loan agreement Sarah's husband signed. You produce the bank's ledger showing every transaction, every fee. You let a committee of these people, right now, inspect them. If everything is in order, we walk away." Thorne's confidence wavered. He could not produce those documents because they would show the manipulation. The original loan paper was probably lost or altered. The ledger entries were fabricated. A public inspection would be his ruin. "You have no authority to make such demands," he blustered. "I have the authority of the people you've wronged," John said, gesturing to the silent line of neighbors. "And we are making it now." A standoff. The two hired hands glanced at each other, uneasy. The sun rose higher, the golden light doing nothing to warm the icy tension. Thorne was cornered, and a cornered animal is at its most dangerous. He made his decision. His eyes, cold and reptilian, locked not on John, but on Sarah. "This is your last chance," he said, his voice silky with threat. "Order this rabble off, sign the quitclaim deed, and take the money. If you do not, I will not only take this land, I will ensure you are charged as an accomplice to this sedition. I will have you in a prison cell before the week is out. And what will happen to your home then?" It was a masterstroke. He shifted the target from the land to Sarah herself. Personal, intimate terror. The color drained from Sarah's face. The gathered townspeople murmured, the first sign of their fragile unity cracking under the threat of real personal consequence. John saw it happening. He moved to stand directly beside Sarah, shoulder to shoulder. He leaned in, his words for her alone, but spoken clearly in the quiet morning. "He's bluffing. He can't afford the scandal of arresting a widow in front of witnesses. He needs this to be clean." But Thorne saw his opening. He smiled, a thin, cruel line. "Is he, Sarah? Are you willing to bet your freedom on the word of a nameless gunslinger? Who is he really? Why was he bleeding in your barn? Did you ever ask? Maybe the sheriff should ask. Maybe he's a wanted man. Did you think of that?" Every eye turned to John. The question hung in the air, poisonously effective. It didn't matter if it was true, it seeded doubt. It reframed the protector as a potential criminal. John's expression didn't change, but Sarah felt a tremor run through him. It was so slight only she could feel it. Thorne had, by sheer luck or vicious intuition, found a fault line, and he was hammering a wedge into it. "Sheriff Cobb," Thorne said, his voice triumphant, "this man is obstructing a lawful proceeding and threatening an officer of the court. I demand you place him under arrest. Investigate him. If he's innocent, no harm done." Cobb looked torn, panicked. The fragile neutrality shattered. The law was a club, and Thorne was swinging it. John slowly raised his hands, a gesture of surrender that felt anything but. He looked at Sarah, his eyes holding a silent apology and a warning. This was the pivot. The fight for the land was suddenly a fight for his own freedom. And as the sheriff stepped forward, hesitant but compelled, the two hired hands moved to flank John. The line of townspeople watched, frozen, their courage evaporating under the stark reality of handcuffs and jail cells. Thorne stepped past the scene, towards Sarah, the quitclaim deed and a pen now in his hand. His voice was a whisper meant only for her. "Sign it, or your drifter goes to prison, and you go with him. The land is still mine. You just get to lose everything else too." Sarah looked at the pen. She looked at John, surrounded. She looked at the faces of her neighbors, their hope turning back to fear. The sunrise that had promised to stand now illuminated a defeat. But as her fingers brushed the cold metal of the pen, she saw something in John's eyes. Not defeat. A fierce, blazing signal. A reminder. A town can tear it down. He was forcing the choice. Right now, was Ash Ridge a town or just a collection of scared individuals? Her hand closed around the pen, but she did not take it from Thorne's hand. She looked past him to Mary Miller, whose husband was in the ground because of this man's papers. She raised her voice, clear and sharp, cutting through the morning. "Mary, you said Tom signed a paper. Would you know his mark if you saw it? Would you swear to it in front of a judge, even if that judge was in Thorne's pocket?" The question landed like a thunderclap. All motion stopped. Thorne's smirk vanished. He hadn't expected her to speak. He expected her to break. Sarah Vale, holding the pen that was meant to sign away her life, had just thrown the first stone, and she was aiming it at the very foundation of his power, the secrecy of his fraud. The battle for the farm was over. The war for the truth of Ash Ridge had just begun. The silence that followed Sarah's question was heavier than any shout. Mary Miller's face, pale and drawn, hardened into something like stone. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "I would swear to it," she said, her voice thin but clear. "On my husband's grave, I would swear." Elias Thorne's composure cracked. The benevolent banker mask fell away completely, revealing the ruthless speculator beneath. "This is an outrage. You are slandering a territorial judge." He whirled on Sheriff Cobb, who looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him. "I'm a patient man, but this ends now. Arrest her for slander. Arrest the drifter for obstruction. Arrest every one of these fools for trespass and conspiracy." But the spell was broken. The townspeople weren't just witnesses anymore, they were participants. And as the blacksmith stepped forward, placing his considerable bulk between Thorne and Sarah, "On what charge exactly?" he rumbled. "For asking a question. The law says we got a right to assemble. The law says we got a right to petition. Seems to me that's all we're doing." He glanced at the two hired hands. "You boys want to try arresting the whole town." The hired men took a step back. They were paid for intimidation, not a riot. Thorne was isolated, his legal bluff called in front of the very people whose fear he relied on. His eyes darted from face to stony face. He saw not just defiance, but the dawning, dangerous light of collective anger. He had overplayed his hand. He retreated to his last bastion, procedure. "Very well," he spat, gathering the shreds of his dignity. "You want to play with the law? We will play. This foreclosure is stayed, pending a formal review, but hear this. The petition will go to Judge Worthington, and I will add charges of defamation, conspiracy, and inciting to riot against every name I hear today. You think you have evidence? I have signed contracts. I have a judge's order. I have the railroad's capital behind me. You have stories. We'll see which a court finds more compelling." With that, he turned on his heel, climbed into his buggy, and ordered his men to follow. The sheriff lingered for a moment, his eyes meeting John. There was a silent apology there, and a warning. He tipped his hat to Sarah, then trudged away. The standoff was over, but the war was just entering a new, more dangerous phase. Back inside the farmhouse, the relief was short-lived. They had won a day, maybe a week, but Thorne's threat was real. A formal court proceeding in Santa Fe with a judge already in his pocket was a death sentence. John rubbed his wrists where the handcuffs had almost been. "We need that ledger," he said. "The bank's real ledger, not the one he shows the judge. The one with the fake fees, the altered dates, the payments to his dummy bidders." Sarah sank into a chair. "It's in the bank. A vault. We'll never get to it." John's gaze was distant, tactical. "Then we need someone on the inside." That someone presented herself that very afternoon. Ilara Thorne, the banker's own daughter, appeared at the kitchen door, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She was 19, a quiet girl Sarah sometimes saw sketching by the creek. She wrung her hands, refusing to come in. "I heard what happened," she whispered. "What my father is doing. It's not the first time. There's a strongbox. In his study at home, not at the bank. He keeps the real records there. He thinks no one knows. Sarah and John exchanged a look of shock. "Why are you telling us this?" Sarah asked gently. Ilara's voice broke. "Because my mother's family owned the land your Northfield sits on. He acquired it from my grandfather after my mother died. I found the letters. He pressured him. He broke him. I live in a house paid for by other people's tears. I can't carry it anymore." She pressed a small, hand-drawn map into Sarah's palm, showing the layout of the Thorne house, the study window, the lock on the strongbox. Then she fled, disappearing into the twilight. This changed everything. It was their miracle, their key, but it was also a trap. Breaking into the banker's home was a felony. If they were caught, any moral high ground vanished. They would be thieves and Thorne would be the victim. John studied the map. "We don't steal it," he said. "We copy it. One page, the page for your farm, the original loan, we photograph it." Sarah stared at him. "A photograph? That's a fortune. We don't have a camera." "In Dust Bend, 2 days' ride from here, there's a surveyor," John said. "He has a camera. He owes me a favor from a long time ago. We get him, we get the evidence, we expose the fraud at the hearing. It's the only way." The plan was insane, risky, but it was the only move on the board. John would ride for Dust Bend at first light. Sarah would maintain the fragile alliance in town, keeping the pressure on, ensuring Thorne couldn't simply change the records before they could be captured. That night, as John prepared his horse, he finally answered the question Thorne had poisoned the air with. "I'm not a wanted man, Sarah, but I left the cavalry under a cloud. There was a commander, corrupt, selling government beef to contractors and letting our horses starve. I reported him. The investigation found no evidence. My career ended. My name was mud. I've been drifting because I don't trust institutions anymore. I only trust what I see, and I see a good woman about to be crushed by the same kind of man." Sarah placed a hand on his arm. "I trust what I see too, John Holt. Now go, bring back our miracle." The next 2 days were an agony of waiting. Sarah visited the families again, solidifying their statements. She learned of 2 more farms Thorne had his eye on. The web was vast. She also learned that Thorne had not been idle. A well-dressed stranger from the Red Rock Railroad had taken a permanent room at the hotel. Riders came and went from the bank at all hours. The town was a kettle about to boil. On the morning of the 3rd day, John returned. He was alone, covered in dust, and his expression was grim. The surveyor was gone, called east on a job. The camera was gone with him. Their miracle had evaporated. Sarah felt the hope drain from her, leaving a cold, hollow dread. Then John allowed himself a small, tired smile. But his apprentice was there, a kid with a knack for drawing, he said, and he handed Sarah not a photograph, but a single sheet of paper. It was a perfect, meticulous architectural drawing, not of a building, but of a document. The apprentice had recreated the original loan agreement between Thomas Vale and the Ash Ridge Mercantile and Trust with an artist's precision. Every flourish of the clerk's pen, every line of the printed form, every signature. And there in the margin, in different ink, was the addendum Thorne had later added, stipulating the so-called administrative and risk fees that doubled the principal. The dates were clear. Thomas had signed the original. The addendum was dated 6 months after his death. It was a forgery, a perfect, undeniable, hand-drawn record of a crime. It wasn't a photograph, it was better. It was a story drawn in ink. A story any judge, even a corrupt one, would have a hard time explaining away if it was presented alongside sworn statements from a dozen citizens. For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to believe they might win. They were wrong. The hearing was set for the following Tuesday in Ash Ridge's makeshift town hall, with Judge Worthington arriving from Santa Fe. The night before, as Sarah and John pored over their evidence, a thunder of hooves approached. It was Anders, his face ashen. "It's Gable," he gasped. "Thorne's men. They went to his daughter's place in the next county, told her they'd burn her house down if old man Gable testified. He's backing out. Mary Miller's gone too, packed a bag and left on the stagecoach. Someone left a rattlesnake in her laundry basket." Thorne was not fighting the evidence. He was dismantling the witnesses. One by one, their coalition was being terrorized into silence. By dawn, only Anders, Sarah, and John were left willing to stand. Their damning evidence was useless without the people to give it voice. The hearing would be a formality. Thorne would present his official, forged ledger. Their beautiful, drawn copy would be dismissed as a fantasy. They had the truth, but Thorne had the power to silence it. As the sun rose on the day of the hearing, John made a decision. He strapped on his old cavalry revolver, a weapon Sarah had never seen him wear. "What are you doing?" she asked, fear gripping her. "I'm going to the hearing," he said, "but I'm not going to argue law. I'm going to make a citizen's arrest. For fraud, for forgery, for conspiracy, right there in front of his bought judge." It was madness, it was suicide, it would likely get him shot. But it was the only play left, a direct, violent challenge to the corruption itself, an appeal not to the court but to the spectacle, to force the hidden violence of Thorne's schemes into the open as real physical violence. Sarah understood. He was turning himself into the final, undeniable piece of evidence. If they jailed him, if they shot him, the crime would be complete and visible for all to see. The town hall was packed, the air thick with tension. Judge Worthington sat at the high table, a portly man with indifferent eyes. Elias Thorne stood confidently, his papers neatly stacked. Sarah and John entered last, drawing every eye. They had no lawyer, no witnesses, just a folder in Sarah's hand and a gun on John's hip. Thorne began, his voice smooth as he outlined the clear, lawful history of the foreclosure. He presented the judge with the official bank ledger. Judge Worthington nodded along, bored. When it was their turn, Sarah stood. She did not address the judge. She turned to face the crowded room, to the people who had stood at her fence line and then been picked off by fear. "You all know the truth," she said, her voice ringing in the quiet hall. "You've lived it. My paper here says my husband agreed to fees after he was in the ground. Mary Miller's paper promised relief that became a noose. Gable's land was sold in an auction with only one bidder. These aren't mistakes, they're a pattern, and a pattern is a plan." She held up the beautifully drawn forgery. "This is the plan, drawn by a boy in Dust Bend because the camera was gone." Sometimes the truth doesn't come with a flash of light. It comes slowly, in ink, in the remembering. "Will you remember with me?" The room was silent. No one met her eye. Thorne smiled. "Emotion is not evidence, Mrs. Vale. The judge has the evidence." He nodded to the ledger. Then John stepped forward. He walked not to the bench, but straight toward Elias Thorne. The room held its breath. Sheriff Cobb half rose from his seat. John stopped a foot from Thorne. "Elias Thorne," he said, his voice carrying to every corner, "I accuse you of fraud, forgery, and criminal conspiracy. As a citizen of this territory, I place you under arrest. You will come with me to the sheriff, and you will submit to a proper investigation of your books." For a second, no one moved. Then Thorne laughed, a genuine, incredulous laugh. The judge banged his gavel. "This is highly irregular. Young man, you are in contempt." John ignored him, his eyes locked on Thorne. The two hired hands, stationed at the back of the room, started forward. John's hand didn't move toward his gun. He simply stood there, a rock in the stream, forcing the violence to come to him. It was the ultimate gamble. Would Thorne's men drag him out in front of everyone? Would the sheriff intervene? Would the town, seeing one man stand alone against the machine, finally find its voice again? Thorne's laughter died. He saw the trap. If his men attacked John, it became a brawl, not a court. If the sheriff helped them, his partiality was confirmed. The clean, legal victory he needed was evaporating. His eyes flickered to the railroad man sitting in the corner, whose expression had grown cold and calculating. The railroad didn't want a scandal. They wanted quiet land. This was becoming very noisy. "Do it," Thorne whispered, so only John could hear. "Have him removed, Sheriff. He is disrupting the court." Sheriff Cobb stood, his hand on his gun, his face a mask of torment. He looked at John, at the determined set of his shoulders. He looked at Sarah, holding her drawn truth. He looked at the faces of his neighbors, and then he did the unthinkable. He sat back down. I believe the citizen has a right to make an accusation, Your Honor. It's procedure." The fracture became a chasm. The judge stared, flabbergasted. Thorne's face purpled with rage. The system was breaking not from without but from within, from a single sheriff's refusal to play his part. In that stunned silence, a new sound started. It was a slow, steady clap, one pair of hands, then another. Anders the blacksmith on his feet, clapping with deliberate, thunderous slaps, then his wife, then the storekeeper, then a farmer from the back. It wasn't cheers. It was a drumbeat, a verdict. Judge Worthington stood, banging his gavel uselessly against the rising tide of sound. "This court is adjourned. We will reconvene tomorrow." He gathered his robes and practically fled the room, the railroad man following with a scowl. Elias Thorne was left alone at the front of the room, surrounded by the echoing applause of his own ruin. He had the law, the judge, the money, but he had lost the town. And without the town's passive acceptance, his paper empire was just that, paper. He turned to John, his hatred absolute. "This isn't over. You have no idea what you've started." John finally took his eyes off Thorn and looked at Sarah. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He was right. It wasn't over, but it wasn't a foreclosure hearing anymore. It was a revolution, and they had just fired the first real shot. The battle for the farm had been a skirmish. The war for the soul of Ash Ridge was now joined, and as the people slowly filed out, their eyes alive with a fire that had been long extinguished, Sarah Vale knew the land was almost beside the point. They had won something far more valuable. They had won back their voice. Now they had to figure out what to say with it. In the hollow silence after the gavel fell and the judge fled, Elias Thorne's empire didn't collapse with a bang. It dissolved like sugar in hot water. The clapping stopped, but the energy remained, a crackling current in the air. People didn't rush the stage, they simply stopped being afraid. They lingered in small groups, talking in low, earnest tones, their eyes occasionally flicking to where Thorne stood, isolated and seething. The railroad man was the first to leave, his face a careful blank. He had seen enough. The investment was too noisy. The risk was now greater than the reward. Thorne left the hall without another word, his polished boots clicking a rapid, angry rhythm on the wooden floor. He did not go to the bank. He went home. The next morning, a notice appeared on the door of the Ash Ridge Mercantile and Trust, closed for audit. Inquiries may be directed to the Territorial Banking Commission in Santa Fe. It was a retreat, not a surrender, but it was a retreat all the same. The foreclosure against Sarah Vale was indefinitely suspended. But suspended was not resolved. The debt still existed on paper. The forged addendum was evidence of a crime, but it didn't erase the original loan. Sarah and John knew the fight wasn't over until the lien was lifted and the title was clean. They had momentum, but they needed a final legal kill. Sheriff Cobb, emboldened by his small act of defiance and freed from Thorne's immediate pressure, agreed to formally accept John's citizen's arrest complaint and open an investigation. It was a thin thread, but it was official. The investigation, however, moved at the speed of molasses in January. The Territorial Commission was backlogged. Judge Worthington, his reputation slightly tarnished by the debacle, was in no hurry to revisit the case. Weeks turned into a month. Spring arrived in earnest, softening the hard ground of Sarah's fields. She and John planted a garden, not knowing if the harvest would be hers to keep. They worked side by side, the rhythm of planting seeds in turned earth, a quiet act of faith. The town of Ash Ridge, meanwhile, underwent a subtle transformation. The general store, once a place of hushed whispers, became a hub of conversation. Farmers began comparing loan documents. Anders organized a meeting to discuss forming a proper agricultural cooperative to secure fair credit. The fear that had been Thorne's fertilizer was gone, replaced by a cautious, rebuilding solidarity. Mary Miller returned, her head held high, and moved in with a cousin on the edge of town. Old man Gable took his wagon and went to stay with his daughter, but he sent back a signed, sworn affidavit, mailed from 2 counties away, safe from Thorne's reach. The break in the case came from an unexpected direction, Ilara Thorne. One evening she appeared again at Sarah's door, not with a map, but with a small leather-bound journal. It was her father's private diary. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice steady. "I'm going to my aunt's in St. Louis. I can't stay here, but you can use this. It's not the ledger, but it's his voice, pages of it." He notes his meetings with the railroad men, his frustrations with stubborn homesteaders, his calculations on profit margins from forced sales. On one page, dated just after Thomas Vale's funeral, he had written a single chilling line: "Widow is vulnerable. No male heir fee adjustment will secure the parcel by autumn." It was a confession, not in a court of law, but in the man's own hand. It was the motive laid bare. John took the journal to Sheriff Cobb the next day. Cobb read the relevant pages, his face growing grim. "This changes things," he muttered. "This is premeditation. With this, I can get a warrant to seize the actual bank records from his house." The law moves slow, but it moves hardest when you have a man's own words against him. The warrant was served. The strongbox was opened. The real ledger was found, its entries a stark testimony to fraud. Faced with incontrovertible evidence from his own home, Elias Thorne's defense crumbled. To avoid a public trial and certain prison time, his lawyer negotiated a settlement. All foreclosure actions stemming from fraudulent fees or addenda were to be voided. The original, unaltered loan amounts would be reinstated. For those, like Sarah, who could not pay even the legitimate debt, a 5-year moratorium on payments was established with a low, fixed interest rate. For Sarah Vale, it meant her farm was hers again, free and clear of the predatory shadow. The debt was reduced to its true, manageable size. She had a fighting chance. The day the official papers arrived, she and John walked the boundary of her land. The spring wheat was coming up green and strong. They stopped beneath the old oak tree at the corner of the property. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked, not looking at him. "The fight is over. Your debt is paid." John picked up a stone, turning it over in his hand. "I was wrong," he said. "Back at the start, I told you I didn't trust institutions. I only trusted what I saw." He looked at her, then at the land stretching out before them. "I see a community that remembered how to be one. I see a piece of earth worth tending. And I see a woman I would follow into any fight, not because she needs saving, but because her cause is just. My debt isn't paid, Sarah. It's just changed hands. I owe you for showing me what to fight for." He didn't ask to stay. He simply stayed. He repaired the barn roof. He helped Anders build a new smithy. He taught some of the younger men how to survey land properly. He became, slowly and without fanfare, a part of Ash Ridge. A year to the day after the frozen morning Thorne arrived with the sheriff, Sarah and John were married under that same oak tree. The whole town came. Anders gave her away. Mary Miller helped her stitch a new dress from store-bought calico, not a feed sack. It was a quiet ceremony, but the joy was deep and rooted, like the things that survive a long drought. Elias Thorne was gone. He sold the bank to a reputable outfit from Denver and left the territory quietly. The railroad rerouted its planned line 15 miles south through less contentious land. The judge retired early. The system, when pressed hard enough by the people it was meant to serve, had corrected itself just enough. John never wore his cavalry blues again, but he didn't hide his past. He served as the town's part-time constable, a role Sheriff Cobb happily delegated. He was fair, firm, and understood that justice was more about balance than punishment. He and Sarah worked the Vale farm together. They didn't get rich, but they got by. The garden flourished. The children of the town, including the ones Sarah would eventually have, played in its shade. Final surprise came 5 years later. A letter arrived from a law firm in Santa Fe. It was regarding the class action settlement from the civil suit the farmers' cooperative had filed against Thorne's estate. With the recovered bank funds, a small restitution payment was being made to every verified victim. The check enclosed was not a fortune, but it was enough to pay off the remaining principal on Sarah's original loan in full. The farm was completely, unequivocally hers outright. No debt. No lien, a clean title. That afternoon, Sarah walked out to the field where John was mending a fence. She handed him the check and the letter of release. He read it, then looked up at her, the sun etching the history of their shared labor into his skin. He smiled, that slow, quiet smile she had grown to love. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. She looked at their land, at the house they had painted together, at the swing they had hung from the oak tree for the children. "It's already done," she said. "We built it. Now we get to keep it." They did more than keep it. They thrived. The Vale farm became known for its hardy seed stock, shared freely with neighbors. The story of the stand at the town hall became local legend, told and retold, a reminder that a single act of courage could be a seed that grows a forest of change. John Holt, the drifter, became John Holt, the cornerstone. Sarah Vale, the widow, became Sarah Vale Holt, the matriarch. The years turned as they do. Their hair grayed. The town of Ash Ridge grew not from railroad money, but from the steady, resilient work of its people. And on the porch of the farmhouse, in the cool of the evening, 2 old people would sit and watch the sun set over the land they had saved, and that had, in turn, saved them. The fight was long over, but the peace they had earned was as deep and enduring as the roots of the old oak tree. It was a victory not just of keeping a home, but of building one together from the rubble of a broken system. And as the first stars appeared, their hands would find each other's, a silent testament to a truth they had lived, that sometimes the most powerful force on earth is not a bank or an army or a law, but a simple, stubborn refusal to leave. The story of Sarah Vale and John Holt is a single thread in a much larger, older tapestry. The stand in Ash Ridge echoes a true, desperate chapter in American history, a time when the very idea of ownership was under siege. In the Great Depression of the 1930s, a third of all American farmers lost their land to foreclosure. The sky turned to dust, prices collapsed, and the banks came calling with impossible debts. But in the face of that crushing force, something remarkable happened. Communities did exactly what Ash Ridge did. They banded together. From Iowa to Nebraska, farmers invented a resistance called the penny auction. When a neighbor's farm was being sold off, they would crowd the property, intimidate outside speculators, and bid mere pennies for the land and equipment, only to return it all to the original owner. It was a direct, defiant rejection of a system that valued profit over people. They formed groups like the Farmers' Holiday Association, led by firebrands like Milo Reno, who urged farmers to withhold their crops from market until they received a fair price. In the town of Lamars, Iowa, a mob of farmers, pushed to the brink, dragged a judge from his bench, and threatened to hang him if he didn't stop signing foreclosure orders. It was the raw, terrifying sound of a people who had nothing left to lose. This wasn't lawlessness. It was a corrective, a moral uprising that forced the law to remember its purpose. Governors issued moratoriums. States passed laws to halt the seizures. The federal government, fearing a wider revolution, stepped in with the New Deal. The fight of one widow and a drifter on a porch is a mirror to that national moment of reckoning. It asks the same question those farmers asked. When the institution designed to protect you becomes the instrument of your destruction, what is your duty? To comply or to resist? Sarah and John's answer, like the answer of thousands in the Dust Bowl years, was to plant their feet and say no more. Not with blind rage, but with evidence, with unity, with a stubborn belief in a deeper justice. They proved that a predator's greatest weakness is his need for silence and complicity. The moment that silence breaks, his power breaks with it. Today, the specific threats may look different, but the underlying dynamics remain. The struggle between the powerful and the rooted, between cold capital and warm community, is a story that repeats. The tale of the Vale Farm is a testament to the enduring truth that land is more than dirt and deed. It is memory. It is legacy. It is the physical ground on which we build our lives and our loves, and the defense of it is one of the oldest, most human stories we tell. It reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important. For Sarah, it was her home. For John, it was the debt of a life saved. For a town, it was their own self-respect. Together, they wove a future from strands of past pain, and in doing so, they left a map for anyone who has ever stood against a Goliath and wondered if it was worth the stone. Thank you for listening to this story of resilience, of love, and of land. If you found a piece of your own fight in theirs, consider subscribing. We have many more tales of forgotten history and unbreakable spirit to share. Until next time, remember, the world is changed not by the loudest voices, but by the strongest roots.